Hello, my name is Nathan Brummel, and I hope you're having a great day. Today we look at part 4 in the life of Theodore Beza, the courtly reformer, the humanist successor of John Calvin. In our last episode, we looked at his conversion and how this led in its aftermath to his move to Switzerland and his taking up a professorship in the academy in Lausanne. Now we move towards that time in Beza's life which has made him famous worldwide, and that is his work as a professor and a minister in the city of Geneva, where he takes up his work towards the end of Calvin's life and then becomes Calvin's successor. In 1558, Beza resigned his professorship at Lausanne. Now, to some strangers or people who didn't know what was going on, this might have surprised. But for those who were in the know, they understood what was going on here. Now, why did his fruitful time at the academy in Lausanne, which was a growing academy and which brought prestige to the city of Bern, which oversaw it as well, why did he leave there? Well, he left in a context in which Bern was throwing their weight around and abusing their authority in the city of Lausanne. The people in Bern had been undermining the ministry of Pierre Viret, the angelic preacher of the Swiss Reformation. In fact, Viret soon would be deposed from the ministry and expelled from Lausanne, where he had ministered for 22 years as a faithful minister and pastor. Beza was a professor at the academy in Lausanne for 9 years. Now, why did Beza leave? Well, Beza left because of the discord in Lausanne over how Bern thought church and state should relate and how this conquered territory of theirs, Lausanne, which they governed over, how they ought to relate church and state. Bern wanted the secular power to control the church and the pastors. Viret, however, would not desecrate the Lord's Supper. There was a laxity of morals on the part of some confessing Christians in Lausanne. There were many people who had experienced an external change of religion. They left the Roman Catholic Church and joined the Reformed churches, but it hadn't affected their personal or social life. And the ministers in Lausanne believed that the Lord Jesus Christ had given authority to his elders and pastors to exercise the keys of the kingdom of heaven, to open the kingdom to those who are walking lives of repentance and faith in Jesus, and close the door to those who are walking unrepentantly in sin. The problem is that the magistracy in the city of Bern, a neighboring Swiss city that was sort of the big brother of Geneva and the big brother of Lausanne, didn't allow that. They were very jealous to have the magistrates in control of Christian discipline, to such an extent that they didn't allow the pastors to carry it out. And you can imagine how much more controversial it is to have the magistrates be in control of who might get excommunicated and who might not. Politics would immediately get involved. Now, this was the same battle that John Calvin had to fight in Geneva, where originally the magistrates, their attitude was, well, we freed ourselves from the bishop, from a Roman Catholic bishop who had the power of excommunication. And now we don't want to have pastors, and in Calvin's case and William Farel's case, especially French immigrants, foreigners, somehow having control of Christian discipline. And so for John Calvin, there was a long battle to have a new church order in Geneva that allowed the pastors to exercise Christian discipline. Now, in the city of Lausanne, there were antinomians, and there were people who did not understand the importance of Christian discipline. They didn't care about how Christian discipline plays an important role in protecting the purity of the church. And these people found support among the magistrates of Bern. Now, in Lausanne, however, the majority of the people, of the Reformed believers, supported the pastors. They loved Pierre Viret. But the representatives from Bern that would show up in the city and would govern it supported Verey's opponents who stood against Christian discipline and really the idea of accountability within the Christian church. Beza, as well as the pastors of Lausanne, were treated insolently by the chief magistrate and council in Bern. They viewed Beza and the pastors in Geneva as simply their servants. So it was in this context that Beza decided to leave Lausanne and this difficult situation. Here he was taking a stand against how Bern was mistreating Pierre Verey and how they were causing controversy within the church in Lausanne. So it was a public statement. Also, he knew the writing was on the wall. He knew that the tension would probably lead to Pierre Verey being removed from office, and that would soon happen. Well, God was in control here, and Lausanne's loss was Geneva's gain. And Beza knew very well that he could find a job in Geneva, so he had to leave Pierre Verey behind for a while, although Beza left because he knew that soon Verey would not be able to carry out his pastorate there. Now, Beza's professorship at Lausanne had been brilliant and successful. He had discharged the duties of his office with great ability, and the learned in Switzerland celebrated what had happened, and also pupils had flocked to him from all parts of Europe. When he came, the Lausanne Academy was quite small, with just a handful of students. By the time he left, there were 700 students there. Now, part of what's going on here, too, is that Bern had started and funded this academy in Lausanne. It was part of their sphere of influence. And what's going to happen is that Beza leaving there is also going to be a blow to the prestige of Bern. Now, the most famous biographer of Beza, Baird tells us the magnetism of the reformer's personality, the profound impression made from the very start by his wonderful erudition, his wide acquaintance with classical as well as sacred antiquity, his growing reputation not only as a controversialist, but as a man honored in the councils of the leading Protestant powers of Switzerland and Germany, and entrusted with the advocacy of the claims of the persecuted both of France and Piedmont, all enhanced in the eyes of the studious the attraction of the school of learning of which he was a chief ornament. When Pierre Verey was kicked out of Lausanne shortly after this, the Lausanne Academy suffered a great blow. The only reason it survived was because Bern's pride was at stake, but the majority of the professors left, and the students, 1,000 people, when Verey was booted out, and most of them moved to Geneva. So Lausanne's loss was Geneva's win. So God had brought now Beza to the city in Europe that John Knox would say the most perfect school of Christ since the time of the apostles. It's now 1558, so this is late on in John Calvin's career. Calvin had been through some very, very difficult times in Geneva, but by now his supporters were the majority in the councils of Geneva, and therefore it was a time of peace. It was a time of shalom and a time of great progress. In Geneva, Beza found a kindred spirit in John Calvin. A kindred spirit, yes, someone with whom he had fundamental theological agreement. It has been the case that in the last 50 years there have been people pushing a Calvin versus the Calvinist sort of thesis, as if John Calvin was the humanist, and then basically all the successors, including Beza, were somehow scholastics, and it's a bunch of nonsense. Beza found a kindred spirit in John Calvin. They both were humanists. They both celebrated the biblical languages. They both were biblical scholars. And they both were what we would call Reformed theologians. And fundamentally, they agreed on the doctrines of grace that sometimes are called now the doctrines of Calvinism. They were also the doctrines of Theodore Beza. And Luther himself, of course, believed in predestination every bit as much as did John Calvin and Theodore Beza. Now, for years prior to this point, Beza had enjoyed an increasing intimacy and brotherly relationship with Calvin. Remember, Lausanne was only 30 miles away from Geneva. You could go back and forth by boat on Lake Geneva. And Beza often made visits from Lausanne to Geneva. Calvin would visit Lausanne. And Calvin recognized his younger friend's great gifts. And he knew very well that Beza could help establish the projected academy in Geneva. Calvin for years had been pushing for the start of what we would call a university and seminary in Geneva. And now the time had come. Who better to get involved other than this man Beza, who had been a rector and a professor at the academy in Lausanne, which had grown spectacularly and matured under his leadership. Calvin also looked at Beza as a younger man who was a potential successor. Now, Calvin wasn't that old yet. He wasn't even 50 years old, but he was often sick. And I think he felt old or much older than that. He also felt very alone at the top. And he desired the fellowship of a gifted biblical scholar and theologian whom he could trust. The work was more than Calvin could bear. Remember, even in the midst of so many different sicknesses, he would work in his bed day and night, and he wished for a man with whom he could share the work. And I think the Lord answered his prayer for help the most when he sent Beza to Geneva. Calvin had hoped to establish a true university, which was a huge undertaking for a little town, a little city-state of only 12,000 people like Geneva. The city didn't have very many resources. They had powerful Roman Catholic enemies to the to the west and to the south. And when the magistrates purchased the ground for the school, they felt like they couldn't support it enough out of the public treasury, so they encouraged people to make bequests to the academy in their wills. The public records of the Republic of Geneva record on January 17 of 1558, a college was established. A college building was erected at Les Hutens de Balomir. 7 classes were started and 3 professors instituted, 1 in theology, 1 in philosophy, and 1 in Greek. Order was given to all notaries to exhort testators to give to the college. Since Geneva didn't even have a high school or a gymnasium, a school was created to prepare men for the academy. That's like putting the cart before the horse. They started the academy and they said, well, for our university, we need students who have finished high school. So they started a high school. Latin literature was studied at the gymnasium or college. First, a school of theology was opened at the academy, and the opening ceremonies occurred on June 5 of 1559 in the city cathedral. Now, this was an impressive service that showed how the city was involved as well as the church. 2 syndics were present, the members of the council attended, and Beza was formally proclaimed the first rector, or what we would call the president. And he was to devote himself to teaching theology. Calvin also taught theology, although remember by theology we mean he taught the Bible. He would lecture through the Bible. Now, Calvin was not formally identified as a professor at the academy since his main job was to be a pastor in the church. But Calvin and Beza both lectured through books of the Bible. Don't imagine that this was teaching that was somehow abstract and just theological in some scholastic way and disconnected from the scriptures. No. They would study both what we would call exegetical theology or biblical theology or books of the Bible, as well as a more systematic approach to theology. While one colleague would devote himself to exegesis, the other might lecture in systematic theology. They both shared this work. Both of the men were Bible scholars. We might know more of Calvin as a Bible scholar because of all his commentaries, but Beza knew the biblical languages inside and out. The school of theology grew, Anton Cavalier was appointed professor of Hebrew. Jean Tagout became professor of philosophy. François Baraud became professor of Greek. The last two had been colleagues of Beza at Lausanne. And soon others from Lausanne would also join them in Geneva. Unfortunately, the professors were only paid about 1,000 francs a year, which was not a living wage. In fact, in times of calamity, the professors went without their salaries. Beza himself often taught without payment. Attendance at the theological school, we would call it a seminary, continued to grow with a swelling stream of students. The Lord blessed this work. In 1569, Beza was able to tell John Knox that the university had so greatly increased the number of its students that he believed that there were few institutions of the kind in Christendom that were better attended. While what we would call the seminary or the theological school prospered, some of the other schools in the academy didn't do so well. One was the School of Medicine. It was open but did not become successful. The study of law did succeed, but they had good teachers at the time, but they just weren't paid enough. They weren't paid a living wage, and therefore often their professors would need to move on to other positions in other universities where they would be paid better. The students at the Geneva Academy subscribed, like their professors, to the doctrines of the Confession of Faith of the Church of Geneva. But later on, Beza and the company of pastors recommended to the council that they get rid of that requirement because they wanted to have Lutheran students study there as well. And they knew that it could be a problem with Lutheran students attending at Geneva if they needed to agree to the Reformed Confession of Geneva. There were even some Roman Catholic students who were teachable, and therefore they didn't want to require them to sign a Reformed confession. You can see that the faculty at this academy were trying to be ecumenical. Beza was also involved in some very important things in France. He spoke at the Colloquy of Poissy. This shows his wider involvement in all the events surrounding the Reformation. The King of France granted an opportunity for the French Reformed, we call the Huguenots, to defend their teaching publicly. Now, this was done in a context where things were very sensitive, but Beza was invited to an opportunity where he could speak before the young king, the queen, and the French cardinals. He was treated with spite by the Roman Catholic leadership when he showed up at this colloquy. But since he was given an opportunity to speak, he took advantage of it. And he spent 20 months in France trying to assist the persecuted churches there, returning home on May 5 of 1563. Now, that colloquy didn't lead anywheres, and the Roman Catholic leadership in France continued to stand against the Reformation. And the religious wars would begin in France. And unfortunately, too, Beza, as we shall see, lived to see the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France. Now, throughout his career, next to Geneva and its academy, the work in France lay nearest to the heart of this Frenchman. And that's not surprising. Fugitives from France continued to pour into Geneva. Becoming reformed in France could be a death penalty. And so Beza tried to encourage the French Reformed churches, and during this time, God also blessed them so that the French Reformed churches began to grow in the number of congregations and in the numbers of the saints. He was very supportive of them and encouraged them, including their leadership, like Admiral de Coligny. In 1571, Beza attended the French Reformed National Synod held within the walls of La Rochelle, and he was honored by being appointed the moderator. He lived through many, many sorrows in France. Oh, how it must have been difficult for this Frenchman to live through the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This butchery that began on the morning of Sunday, August 24, 1572, in the city of Paris, and then spreading outward, gave a fresh opportunity to Beza and to the Republic of Geneva to show love and mercy towards the persecuted and hounded Protestants in France. In Paris, on St. Bartholomew's Day, not only was Admiral Coligny murdered, but tens of thousands of Reformed believers in France. And then the murderous rampages spread to other cities throughout France. Reformed Christians at Lyons, for example, were murdered in mass like sheep. Beza wrote, "At Lyons, all excepting a small number of persons saved by the cupidity of the soldiers, presented themselves of their own accord to be shut up in the prisons. Them themselves offered their necks to the knife. Not one drew a sword, not one murmured, not one was questioned. All were butchered like sheep at the shambles, and meanwhile the pretext was raised of a conspiracy. O Lord, thou hast seen these things, and thou wilt judge." So Beza experienced this terrible persecution unleashed against his fellow French Reformed believers. And he oversaw the collection of funds in the church in Geneva to provide for homeless French Reformed believers who fled for their lives to Geneva. But the massacre in Paris and all this evil that was happening towards the Reformed churches did not dishearten Beza, because he believed, of course, in a God who was sovereign. Yes, it's true, he had hoped for a speedy conversion of France to the gospel. There had been hope at times that the leadership would join the Reformation. And it certainly did chill his interest in his native land. And God had gathered many, many saints in the French Reformed churches. And so he remained an advocate and really a wise counselor to the French Reformed churches. But he would hear about reports of losses by the Huguenot armies. And so it was a difficult time for Beza. And so Beza began to use his gifts in many directions. He was a professor and rector at the academy. He is advocating on behalf of the French Reformed. He is also beginning to write widely. Next time we're going to look at how Beza succeeded Calvin and how he carried on Calvin's work as he succeeded Calvin as the leading pastor and preacher in the city of Geneva.